Hi everyone and welcome back. If you are listening to this at the time of release, Happy New Year. I hope you've been having a wonderful start into 2025 and that it will only continue on like this. If you watch this as a video, you will notice that I'm in a different location right now. I'm actually sitting in my childhood room in the south of Germany, which is the very place I wrote my City of Lights poem. So I thought it'd be only appropriate to tell you a little bit more about that today. And I will also talk a bit about my influences as a writer and specifically as a poet. And I thought it'd be fun to break down the poem, do something along the lines of an analysis, but with a little bit more of an insight. Before we begin though, let's take some breaths together, shall we? I would love to introduce you to something called a physiological sigh, and that consists of 2 inhales, so 2 sips of air through your nose. Think of it as 1 normal inhale and then just a little extra inhale for maximum oxygen in your body, and then a long exhalation through your mouth. If you're able to, I invite you to close your eyes here. You can also place 1 hand on your chest, 1 hand on your belly. So let's first just exhale and empty our lungs. And now inhale twice through your nose. Hold at the very top. And now slowly sigh it out through your mouth. 2 more times like this. Take 2 sips in through your nose. Hold at the top. And now sigh it out through your mouth. And then 1 last time. Inhale twice through your nose. Hold for just a moment. And now sigh it out through your mouth. Go back to your normal breathing pattern and just linger in this stillness for an extra moment and observe what these 3 deep breaths have done to your breath and to your body and to your mind. If you've had your eyes closed, gently blink them open again. Welcome back. I hope you're feeling a little more grounded. This is one of my favorite breathing techniques for when I'm feeling stressed or anxious. And maybe it can serve you too. Alright, so City of Lights. I'm gonna split this video into 2 parts. So we'll start with the idea and inspiration, and then we'll go more into an insight behind me as a writer. And maybe it will also inspire you to have a go at poetry. I would love that. But as I mentioned in my previous episode, it took me 3 years to write that poem. And I remember in the beginning, it was as if I had a grasp on the idea, an outline, and I could see the shape of the poem, but I didn't have the right words yet to flesh it out. And it actually all makes sense if you think about it, because by nature, the words "I moved to Paris," there's something retrospective about it. And so I had to be patient and just find out what those things would be. I cannot recall anymore if I was still physically here in Germany or already in Paris in my first sublet when those first 2 lines came to me, which were, "I moved to Paris for the light as the darkness had poisoned mine." It honestly just came to me. It's not like I sit down and I decide I'm gonna write some poetry. It really just comes to me. And I think it really is an art to be able to make the space in your head, in your life, to observe your thoughts and to observe if something like that comes up and then catch it and note it down. Because if you don't, it's just gonna evaporate and disappear, and maybe someone else will catch onto it. So it kind of just came to me like a whisper. I can't explain it any other way. And with that, I already felt the purpose of this poem, and I intuitively knew that this poem would be 4 stanzas long with 4 lines each, and I'd make use of an anathema, meaning each stanza would start with the words "I moved to Paris," and then each stanza would then explore another reason why I would move to Paris. I actually have a memory of sitting in my first sublet in Paris in Charonne when I had just moved, and I was actively trying to write the rest of the poem, and it just didn't work because it wasn't the right moment. But I did actually write a first stanza that went, "I moved to Paris for the light, as the darkness had poisoned mine, dark droplets spreading intertwined, once blank, pristine, spotlessly white." So that was kind of capturing the idea of a tainted canvas. And I just had that imagery in my head of, those accidental drops of ink on a perfectly white piece of paper, and then they're just like spreading. But after that, I got stuck and I just didn't know how to continue on. But it actually makes sense if you think about this and look at it, because the focus with that stanza was elaborating on that darkness that I had mentioned in the second line. And that's kind of pre-Paris period. It's not Paris. So it didn't align with what this poem was going to be like. So it didn't work. And with that, I was back at square one because I just didn't have what I needed yet to write that poem. But over those years, I would always get back to it. I never forgot about it. I had it as a note saved in my notes app. It kind of was like I had the recipe to a cake that I really wanted to bake, but it just wouldn't work. And I would try to bake it every time and something else would go wrong. Saying of that metaphor, it was as if I had that recipe, but I didn't have the right ingredients yet. And those ingredients in this case were the people I'd meet and the experiences I would have. And I tried baking something with what I had experienced before, and that didn't work. It didn't taste right, the consistency wasn't right, the texture wasn't right. So I had to put it aside. And in the meanwhile, I was just living life. I was out there feeling, experiencing, reflecting, and I created so many other things. So it's not like I got stuck on one idea and then abandoned creating altogether. I just let that idea sit for a bit. And then one day, it was as if I had a craving, and so I went to my metaphorical fridge and had a peek at what I could find inside, if anything would tickle my fancy. And then I realized, oh, hold on, I still have this recipe I've always been wanting to try out. I actually so happen to have all the ingredients. It's kind of ironic if I think about it, because this all happened during a moment when I couldn't bear being in Paris because of reasons I touched on in my last episode. And it really felt like I had built myself a life there that I loved and that was going to lead to a future that I was excited about, with people that I cared about and loved. And it was all so strongly connected to the city. But then my relationship with those people crumbled, and so did my relationship with Paris. But in comparison to those people, Paris is neutral. Paris was still there, it was stable, and with that, it was fully up to me what I would do with all of that. So if I wanted to make amends and repair that relationship or not. And really, it was that moment of conflict that unlocked that door for me to finally write that poem. And in a way, maybe it was a reminder, a silver lining, or maybe it was a metaphorical olive branch that I got gifted by the city, who knows. But when my friend Marley and I were working on the City of Lights video, if you want to play along with that metaphor that I came up with, it was basically as if she helped me with the icing and decorating of the cake. So she helped me not only make sure that the cake would taste heavenly, but also look beautifully. And what I'm doing now is serving you a slice of that cake with a cup of coffee while we're having a conversation, a chat about this. That's how I like to view it. and I have to admit it's not been that often that I extend an invitation and serve my own homemade cake and coffee with the world. It is one of the first times, actually, and especially the fact that I'm offering a conversation around this and an insight into it too. But I wish more people would do it, because this is something that I personally just love to explore and see, and something that I find really inspirational. And being a writer feels so vulnerable though at moments, because it's a piece of your soul on display for everyone to see, and also to misinterpret if you want to. So to juxtapose that, I feel like with photography, with visual work only and imagery, it's so much easier to just hide behind a visual, especially if I think about the type of modeling that I used to do. With imagery, it's also very easy to just get distracted by the aesthetics only, so how things look on the surface, not how things feel underneath. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think it's much easier to appreciate something like that and to digest something like that. It's more accessible. But I personally have felt so much more drawn lately to projects that just have a bit more depth and real meaning and storytelling and emotions that make me think and feel, and hopefully do the same with other people. Of course, it's not for everyone. Art is not for everyone, but it wouldn't be real art if it were. Still, if you're open-minded enough, you can recognize and respect something without liking it, in a way that is cognitive dissonance, which you have to get used to and train, but there's just so much value in it. Before we dive into the second part of this video, I wanted to announce that if you are in Paris on the 19th of January, you might be interested in joining my Creative Intentions workshop, which I'm hosting in the very studio where I did my first yoga teacher training. It's close to Nation. And I will add some more information in the show notes below, but during this 2.5-hour workshop, we will be exploring the differences between a sankalpa, an intention, and a goal, how to apply them, how to set them, how to utilize them to your advantage. We'll also be reflecting on 2024 and how to use that to guide our 2025 successfully, and we'll talk about affirmations and manifestations, and there'll be a lot of mindful movement, some gentle yin yoga to help you create space in your body and in your mind, and some pranayama, which is breathing exercises, similar to what we did in the beginning, and guided meditation, chanting, discussions, a nice cup of tea. I'm personally really looking forward to it. I think it will be a lot of fun, and hopefully a very inspiring and mindful and cozy afternoon in good company. I like to keep my workshops fairly small and intimate, so there are 5 spots available only, but whether you are an experienced practitioner or a total beginner, maybe you want to start a yoga journey this year even. Also, whether you consider yourself a creative or not. As humans, we are all creatives, but you are welcome to come exactly as you are. The power of editing. We are back in Paris, which you can tell if you're watching this as a video. So let's have a little chat about my writing, shall we? I have to admit that it was only in preparation for this episode that I sat down to start and think about my influences as a writer, and more specifically as a poet. And that was an incredibly interesting thing to do. If you are a creative of any sorts, I encourage you to sit down and do the same thing, because it is so revealing. It shows you so many things about why you do things a certain way and what your default is in your programming. And the more awareness you have about your creations and your patterns, the more you can control that. So maybe you really want to lean into that, or maybe you would choose to do the complete opposite. Just the more information you have, the more you can do with it. So what you should know about me, first and foremost, is that I was born and raised in Germany, and I lived there for my first 18 years of my life before I moved abroad to several different places. But my first experience writing and reading was in German. And while I personally don't love the German language, I don't think it's particularly pretty, I do think it deserves a better rep than it generally has. Because as a language itself, I feel like there is a lot of contrasting beauty that you can find if you know where to look for it. But German is a very literal language that is hard to mold. And just to juxtapose that, I would say that writing in English is like playing with clay, whereas writing in German is like playing with Lego. You can build something extremely beautiful with either, but the feeling to it will always be different. And there's a lot more structure and harshness to the German language, which applies to everything, to the sound, the grammar, the spelling. And with that, there's overall this higher level of complexity and richness, but it does also make it less approachable and not as easily digestible as other languages, such as English, for instance. And I only learned later on that there are quite a few differences between English poetry and German poetry. And I find that those differences really reflect the characteristics of each language. So German poetry is a lot more structured. You've got your stanzas, you've got your end rhymes, and your metrical patterns. And because of this natural rhythm that the German language has, trochees, trocheos in German, are generally more common. That's the pattern of stressed, unstressed syllables, whereas in English, if at all, it's the opposite. It's more natural to have the pattern of unstressed stressed syllables, which are called iambs or jambos in German. But because of how flexible the English language is, having a rigid metrical pattern often feels very forced and unnatural. So it's less of a thing than in German poetry. But I'm personally just very used to that. But then, of course, the more modern you go, the less rigid anything is, because creative liberties and really using stylistic devices in a tasteful manner is an art in itself. And what I think is very interesting, though, is that German poetry used to be very often set to music, which is less the case for English poetry. So in other words, German poetry is closer to song lyrics than English poetry is. And I've never written a song in German before, but I do feel like oftentimes in English, lyrics are basically just shitty poetry that are set to good music. I'd actually love for a musician to comment on that, but that's how it sounds like to me. Obviously, there is so much more that we could dive into here, but this is just to give you a bit of an overview and understanding of my writing background. And I used to do a fair amount of creative writing in German, including poetry, but those are things that were never motivated by myself. These were always school projects or extracurricular things that I did. But when I started writing for myself, it would always be in English. And I feel like that is because of how moldable the language is, and it just suits me and my style a lot better. And I feel like when I'm writing, oftentimes it's like I'm painting, actually. I'm painting, but instead of using color, I'm using words. And that just is more fun to me than playing with Lego, I guess. But when it comes to my poetry overall, there are a couple of things that I do fall back onto a lot. So for instance, I use a lot of metaphors, in case you haven't noticed yet. And creating imagery and storytelling are very important to me. And I think another big thing is rhythm, which is on one hand very strongly influenced by German and German poetry in that background that I just told you about, but also by my dance background, I want to say, because I used to do ballroom dance and Latin dance, and that is very highly dependent on rhythm. And if you're someone who listens to a lot of music, having that awareness and looking at music from that angle is just another amazing tool to connect with that piece of music. I honestly really love it. And I had a discussion not too long ago about how in my songwriting, I'm less hesitant to go for a 3/4 time, like a waltz rhythm, just because I'm more familiar with it. And I take that same rhythm and musicality with me into my poetry. And then lastly, sound and the flow and harmony that it can create is obviously a very big thing for me. On one hand, it has to do with my love for music and lyrics, but I do think it also has to do with my love for languages, actually. So in case you don't know, I speak 7 languages. I can communicate in all of them if I have to, but I speak German and English most fluently, followed by French, just because I live in France and I just passed my C1 exam, so there was a lot of practice that went into it. But I did grow up with two tonal languages, which were Vietnamese and Teochew, which is a Chinese dialect. And growing up with tonal languages where it really matters how you pronounce something because it changes the meaning of the word really trains your awareness. And I think this is why, in general, I have less issues with accents when it comes to learning a foreign language. So these are kind of the ingredients to my kind of poetry. And let's see what that's like in practice with my City of Lights poem. So I have my poem right here. As I mentioned before, this poem is made up of 4 stanzas with 4 lines each. Very square, very classic. There is the anaphora of I moved to Paris, which starts off each stanza. And there is a mix of end rhymes and internal rhymes, and also a mix of metrical patterns. But let's take a look at each stanza individually. So the first stanza goes, I moved to Paris for the light, as the darkness had poisoned mine. I dreamt of muses sipping wine, and wished on every dandelion. So first off, Paris is obviously known as the City of Lights. And in the first 2 lines, we have this contrast of light and darkness. And the word poison somewhat personifies that darkness and turns it into the antagonist, whereas Paris is presented as the protagonist and the antidote, so to say. And obviously the whole idea of coming to Paris for a new start is a tale as old as time. Then we have a metaphor, which is I dreamt of muses sipping wine, which stands for kind of this intoxicating inspiration and joy, followed by that symbolism of dandelions, because you always wish on dandelions. Obviously that is putting that wish out there to both move to Paris, but also to find that light and that inspiration again. So there is an iambic pattern of unstressed and stressed syllables in the last 2 lines, which creates a certain flow when you read it. Then the second stanza goes, I moved to Paris to follow the wind, and his promise that a new chapter would begin. He caressed my ear and whispered, my dear, a million lives and deaths will await you here. So there's a personification of the wind here. The wind being a metaphor for intuition. And rhythmically, there's a dactyl pattern, which is stressed, unstressed, unstressed. So it's actually nothing other than a waltz. And the words caressed and whispered kind of create this atmosphere of a very intimate and secretive scene. There's also this combination of an internal rhyme, an end rhyme, and assonance, which is the repetition of the same vowels. So this you can see with the words ear, dear, death, and here. And I deliberately chose the words a million lives and deaths because moving to Paris has generally felt like living several lifetimes in the span of a few years, which is honestly crazy. Maybe not normal. So then the third stanza, it goes, I moved to Paris to soothe my soul. I took what I could and jumped down the rabbit hole. With a heavy heart, I left them behind, all the could have beens, all the misaligned. So to start with, I find the word soothe has such an onomatopoeic quality to it that I love. And there's also the alliteration with soothe my soul. And that sounds very pleasing to the ear, I find. And it's followed by the internal rhyme of took and could, which also are round vowels. So it all just harmonizes really well. And it's kind of like slower, whereas the last 2 lines of the stanza, they have the same rhythm and they go a bit faster. And it's not even about how to stress the syllables, but the length and speed of them. So there are 10 syllables and they go quick, quick, slow, 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 quick, 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 slow, slow. So it's with a heavy heart, I left them behind, all the could have beens, all the misaligned. It just flows. I don't know. I pay attention to that. And then the final stanza, it kind of acts as a resolution. It goes, so I moved to Paris and tried to build a home, a place to belong, something I've never known. I danced barefoot on roofs and feasted of the art to feel the flame that still burns in my heart. So especially if you compare the first line of each stanza, this one is different because it's active, it's about an action, it's about building a home. And on top of that, timeline-wise, building a home is obviously not something that you can just do overnight. It's something that takes time. And I deliberately chose the verb tried in the first line for two reasons. Firstly, when you say you tried to do something instead of saying you did something, it always raises the question of, did you succeed or did you fail? What happened? It's always hinting towards something, and I kind of wanted to add that in there as this moment of food for thought. And secondly, it actually adds a bit of a dramatic pause in there. And so I moved to Paris and tried to build a home. There is naturally the stress that goes on tried, followed by this flow of words. And then after that, we've got a couple of metaphors. Firstly, dancing barefoot on roofs, that's imagery of freedom and celebration. And then feasting off the art, that kind of ties back to the muses sipping wine in the first stanza. And then finally, to feel that flame that still burns in my heart. That is an imagery that I love to use. And it's just this internal fire and passion that keeps us going. And it's actually in reference to a number of other poems that I've written. So it's a recurring image in my little poetic universe. But something that I love about the stanza is that the first and third line and the second and fourth line have the same amount of syllables and the same stress and rhythm to them, which creates this really nice flow. So that is to say, and so I moved to Paris and tried to build a home, and I danced barefoot on roofs and feasted of the art. And then you have a place to belong, something I've never known, and to feel the flame that still burns in my heart. In the video version, however, I actually made the conscious choice to change the inflection of the second line. So in the video, I'm saying a place to belong, something I've never known, just because I felt like it supported the messaging better. You know, it's always hard to say whether I wrote everything consciously with all of these things in mind. I think it often just works like building blocks that you refine and test out. And stylistic devices are tools, and it's great to have them in your back pocket, and it's great to be aware of them. But writing poetry just comes very naturally to me, and I do think it's my love for metaphors and reading between the lines. But at the same time, because I'm often so focused on rhythm and sound, it's almost like making music in its most minimalistic form. So if you take anything away from this, I think that poetry is meant to be read out loud. And good poetry is like an iceberg. There's so much more to it than you can tell by first glance. The other takeaway is, don't ever throw away your ideas. If you get stuck and it doesn't work, that's fine. Just archive it and then revisit it every now and then. Don't ever throw them away. You never know when the time is right for them to hatch. Having ideas is kind of like having all these different sized eggs, and you are an incubator, or you have an incubator, and you just check up on them every now and then to see if any of them are ready to hatch. Or it's like checking your fridge, like I said earlier, for ingredients for a recipe that you might have. So in my written Substack posts, I normally always like to add some journaling prompts at the end, but I feel inspired to give a creation prompt this time around, which I will also put in the show notes. But our creation prompt for today is, pick a place that you've been to, and in your medium of choice, create something that encapsulates the energy of that place or how that place makes you feel. And that place could be a city, it could be a country, it could be an establishment, it could be a street, it could be someone's home, whatever floats your boat. If you do want to give poetry a go, maybe you want to pick one of the things I mentioned today and incorporate that consciously. So maybe that's some specific metaphor or a magical pattern or anything along those lines. If you end up doing anything of that, I would love to see it or read it. So please let me know. And I think that's all I have for you today. So thank you so much for tuning in. Again, Happy New Year. I hope this has been a great start so far. And I hope to see you again very soon. Stay creative. Bye.